welcome to my latest video. In this video we're going to be looking at a mummy from the Shambling Undead Blood Bowl team, and specifically we're going to be looking at how to paint the armor on it in a kind of bronze, weathered bronze with verdigris effect on it. So I used to play a lot of Blood Bowl when I was a kid, and I've recently been thinking it might be fun to get back into it. But it also will be fun to paint up kind of like a couple of teams. So I've got obviously the Shambling Undead, but I've also got the Nurgle, or the Rotbringers, something like that anyway. So I'm going to be doing a few videos looking at how to paint these and some of the different effects. I am going for a more grimdark kind of look to it. What I did notice on a lot of the Blood Bowl teams is, because it's kind of like a fun setting, so it's kind of like set in the old world old world setting, but it's also like an alternate kind of reality within the old world setting, because obviously it doesn't make much sense when you get things like chaos and undead and dwarves and elves and things all coming together to play basically American football without killing each other. So it's just kind of like a fun setting, and I think a lot of the paint schemes that come out of that sort of fun atmosphere represent the colour scheme sort of fit in with that, whereas I thought it'd be interesting to go for a much more grimdark kind of feel to it. You can see at the moment obviously the model's already primed black, and the base is glued on. Everything's put together. I've filled in the holes. By the way, if you get these models, they have holes in the bases for sticking other parts to them. It's a little bit irritating, but all you have to do is just get a bit of paper and glue it on, because you'll be putting kind of like grass on top of that anyway, so you won't be able to see it. I've just been starting with some Mournfang brown, and I've pretty much just slathered it in various places on the model. So obviously the whole model will have to be painted, so just to save me some time, I also filled in some areas where his bandages are and things like that, but they're not going to be covered so much in this video. So to start with, and as I mentioned, we're doing like a weathered bronze look. I will be showing you how to paint the weathered bronze before adding the verdigris, so if you don't want to add the verdigris, you'll be able to stop at that stage. And all I'm doing is using, just to start with, like a size 2 Artisopus brush, and again sticking with the Mournfang brown, and I'm blocking in kind of the light source parts on the model, and also filling in a very, very rough, loose texture effect. The paint is probably around about 50-50, maybe a little bit more water. You want it to be fairly sort of runny as you apply it, but not so runny that it will just run straight into recesses and things. What you'll find is that the colour looks quite strong when you first apply it, but as it dries it becomes much darker, and the translucency of the paint, especially because it's thinned, but also Mournfang brown does have an element of translucency to it. The black primer will show through underneath. The marks that you're making when you are applying this, it's very much using the tip of the brush primarily, but then if you want to cover an area a bit more, just push a bit harder and you get more surface contact with kind of like the side of the brush a little bit. You also want to be paying attention to what direction the angle of the armor is in. So for example, the head and the left shoulder pad, as we look at it here, they're facing upwards, so they're going to catch a lot of light, so you can really go to town on, you can almost cover that surface area, just leaving very small bits here and there of black. But on the other shoulder pad, that's facing down, so that wants a lot less paint coverage, because that will be in shadow. That doesn't mean to say that it's going to be left unpainted, and there will be elements of high contrast applied to it, which you'll see that suddenly kind of like appear in the video. The technique is all the same, so sometimes I'll paint a little bit off camera, and then but you should still be able to interpret how to do that from everything else that I show you in the video, because there's obviously a fair few parts of the model that are painted in with the weathered bronze. So I've covered all the armour at this stage in the Mournfang brown, and now I moved on to XV88. So if you look at the top left there with the wet palette, on the far left, that was the Mournfang brown. In the middle is Rhinox hide. That's more there just to knock back anything if I go a little bit heavy with some of the mark making, because that will allow me to blend the Mournfang brown into the black. You know, if you've maybe not thinned the Mournfang brown enough, or you get like a really harsh line, you can then sort of go over it a bit with the Rhinox hide, and then it will create kind of like a transition, just soften it down. If you want, you can also add some black paint to the wet palette. Then you can use that as a rubber as well. With the XV88 here, I'm pretty much still doing exactly the same thing as I was with the Mournfang brown, but the brush marks are more refined. So you can see I'm going a lot slower now. Whereas before, when I was applying the Mournfang brown, I was just absolutely slapping the paint on there without a care, and it's really nice and sort of freeing to paint like that. You don't have to, because I'm getting Mournfang brown over all the model anyway. It doesn't matter if you catch a little bit here or there, especially on the armor, because random brush marks will actually help the weathered effect. There's going to be scratches and dents and all sorts of little bits all over it. So even random marks that you don't intend to put there will make it look kind of more interesting. But when you then come to the XV88 here, it's the same kind of thing, but you're actually looking at the marks that you made before, and you're looking to interpret those to turn them into damage. So there will be larger patches of dark where the primer is still showing through, and all you have to do is sort of work around those. And like if you paint the lower edges of them, it'll give it like a three-dimensional look, but also you can see that I'm doing a very sort of scratchy motion. Again, the movements are very similar to the Mournfang brown, but they're just smaller. Like, because I'm using the very tip of the brush only, it creates a thinner line, and you're doing those over and over again. But also you're looking. So I mentioned some of the areas are darker. You can still go then with the XV88 and do like a little dot or a little line or a couple of dots, or all sorts of interesting random marks, just to fill in the area. You don't want to leave any part of the armor as just black or just Mournfang brown, because it'll look sort of unfinished. But it is nice to have sort of larger patches that are still quite dark, because then in those dark areas, every time you put like a little dot or dash or whatever of the XV88, that will stand out much more strongly. So then it will then be interpreted as a scratch in the dark area, and the light's just catching it. What you will find as well is, exactly the same as when I mentioned with the Mournfang. When you first apply it, the colour looks quite strong and quite opaque, but as it dries, the lower layers of paint will show through. So you do have to do multiple layers of paint. The nice thing about doing that is you can build up layers of texture, and you can also use that as a way to create a transition. So if you paint the area larger to begin with the first layer of XV88, and then as you keep adding additional layers to make the colour more opaque, you just sort of shrink it a little bit or do different patterns on top of it, so you get like various opacities of paint, and that basically what you end up is with lighter and darker amounts or highlights of the one colour that you've used, just because you're relying on the opacity of the paint. So now we're up to Balor brown, and it's exactly the same process again, but at this stage you're looking more, it's really about refinement. So you're looking more at picking out edges, sharp details, things like the rivets that hold the armor plates together. Really looking for any of the little details that you've painted on that can be then turned into three-dimensional areas. And again, the three-dimensional effect is just achieved by painting the lower sort of crease or whatever, the lower line. So if you've got a dent, if you imagine like a little hole in a surface, and you can see this actually on the ones that are sculpted on there. He's got two little holes right sort of on the curve going into the neck area. You can see how the light from my lamp is just catching the lower edge, and it sort of you're trying to replicate that but on a smooth surface. So if you've got like a dark patch and you paint the lower edge, it makes it look three-dimensional. The other thing to bear in mind is, so I mentioned before that this shoulder pad area and the helmet and things, they're lighter. So the light volumes that you're painting on, because you are basically painting on light volumes, which is the size of the highlight, they're going to be large, so it fills in the area and it just makes the whole area look lighter. So these are quite large, even going up to so it's going to go up to ice yellow and white in some places, although I'll talk more about that when we get to it. But you're going to be using a lot of those colors on this side of the model, but towards the other side, which you can't quite see as clearly because it's facing away from the camera, but it's going to be kept to like a darker color. If you find that you over highlight the more shadowy areas, don't panic. In fact, it can be beneficial to over highlight them. So if you painted all of the armor panels exactly the same way that you've done here, like on this shoulder pad, all you then have to do is take the Mournfang brown and Rhinox hide and turn those into glazes, and then you can glaze over the shadowed areas. Or when I say glaze, what I mean is, so it's just taking the same color paint, and you can either add it into a well palette, which is like a sort of a dry palette but with a hole. You see me use them every now and then, but I've more taken to just doing them on the wet palette. All you have to do is just take some of the paint, put it in a different part of the wet palette, and add additional water to it, so it becomes very, very see-through. It's like dirty water. You load your brush up, rub off the excess on some kitchen roll so it doesn't pool when it touches the model, and then any area that you want to be shadowed in a sort of a shadow part on the model, just gently glaze those colors over it, and it'll knock all the colors right back. But you'll still get an element of the texture showing through. So I know some people are a little bit lazy when it comes to painting shadowed areas on a model, and they tend to leave them black, so it's just black primer, which can look fine in photos, but obviously if you're going to use this for gaming, people will be able to see it, and all they'll see in reality is that it looks like black unpainted parts of the models in the shadows. So really, you want to paint in the shadows, they just need to be like darker textures. But it's all the same process still, but you just making them darker with the glazing, or by not highlighting them as much as I'm doing here, but you're still getting the same sort of textured look anyway. Because of so there's a little skip there where I pushed the helmet highlights on that section brighter. The main reason I do things like that is because I want to test them myself, just so that when I come to paint the parts on the model, I achieve the desired effect. Because every time you do these things, although I know what I'm doing, it is nice to just get everything spot on. Just makes my life a little bit easier. And also because I get a little bit excited when I'm painting these, and I want to rush ahead, and I'm like, oh, that's a fun bit to paint, so I just do that. But hopefully you'll still get the idea as we progress on it. The helmet is quite interesting. All I've done, so exactly the same thing as I did with the Mournfang brown, XV88 and the Balor brown, except I just took it up to ice yellow and painted like a smaller section on there on the top curve, and a little bit on the bottom section. The main thing to get right with non-metallic metals is that you get like reflections and bounces all over. You can add additional reflections that you can't actually see. So when you hold it under a lamp, that's your primary light source. That's giving you all the reflections for that. You can tweak them as you see fit. If you think a highlight looks better in a certain place, and do it. No one's going to come and arrest you because you put a highlight in somewhere that isn't perfectly realistic just because you wanted it to look better. And I get quite frustrated with people, when they leave comments and things saying, "Oh, that's not accurate," just for the sake of. In fact, I've even had people do like 3D renders trying to say, "Look, that's where the light source should go." It doesn't matter if that's where the light source should go. It's purely dependent, because you have like a fixed light source when you paint it on the model. You need to paint it so that it looks good. Realism is completely secondary. But I kind of lost my thread a little bit there. But the highlights that you put on here. So like I'm talking about like I said, the primary light source highlights. You paint all those in, but it doesn't give you the bounce highlights. Whereas to make non-metallic metal look kind of effective, you do need bounce highlights, and also you have to take into account the fact that this is on a small scale, so that light will look a little bit different depending on how large something is. So you're trying to add additional highlights to this to make it seem like it's not like a tiny little model when you're painting it, basically. And to do that, all you have to do is like you just paint light into recesses. You paint, and this is an important thing as well. People always paint the raised areas for highlights, and then they paint the recesses as shadows, and that's not accurate, because if you look at, I mean, you can just see when you hold the model under a lamp, you see the light will go into recesses because it's in a direct line from the light, and light's traveling in a straight line. So even if it's a recess, like if it's a crease, the light hits there and it's highlighted. It doesn't matter if it's going inwards or outwards. So like concave or convex, doesn't matter. It's still catching the light. And the other thing is, like, so downwards facing edges, they don't want to be as bright as upwards facing edges, because upwards facing edges are obviously directly in line with the light source, so they will be very, very bright. But downwards facing edges will still catch bounce highlights from things, and even from the primary light source, they will still, pick out edges a little bit more cleanly. So you can paint edges everywhere, but just keep in mind that if it's an upwards facing edge, it needs to be brighter. And then on top of that, you can just add in little reflections anywhere. So because he's got quite big panels on his shoulders, and you can see there, so those, he's got like a little triangle on the the top left section, and just below that, I just filled in those with sort of random marks. I didn't put those aren't referenced highlights, because if you just hold that under a lamp, you're basically getting reflections off of a shiny plastic surface, whereas a kind of weathered bronze surface will reflect light a little bit differently, because it'll have sort of defects all over it, and again scale and all sorts of different things. And also, like, you could just get random reflections from different parts of the model, like someone could be setting off firework or whatever, and you get a reflection on there, or there could be someone with really shiny armor standing right next to him, and the light will bounce off that, hit your model, or character within in universe terms, and that will then again create like a light source, like a duller light source on the model. So all these things, I know that sounds very complicated, but they're all entirely optional, these sort of reflected lights. And again, it all comes down to, does it look good or not? So if there's a blank space on the model and it's like not in the direction of the primary light source, and you just think it looks really dull and boring because there's no reflection there, just paint one in. Just make sure it's not as bright as the primary light source reflections, and it just adds like a bit more interest on the model. When I'm applying these highlights, you can see now, as I come to the using more of the ice yellow, it's much more of a stipply kind of effect. So you're basically adding a texture to the surface. It's a kind of an easier way of painting non-metallic metal. You don't have to spend ages getting like perfectly smooth transitions. In fact, the rougher this sort of looks, the more effective the result, as long as the light volumes are accurate for their position. And again, you get those by holding it under the lamp. That it gives you roughly the shape, not perfectly the shape, because again, you're just getting reflections on a plastic surface, but it's close enough that if you follow them and tweak them, it'll look good enough. That gives you your light source, and then as you're just applying texture in those areas, just like this sort of stipply effect. And remember, you've got like scratches and stipples all over the place, but you focus them on the light volume highlight areas, and it's very easy to fill them in. They don't all have to be perfect. They can all be random shapes and things. Just make sure, the main thing is just make sure you don't have too much paint on your brush. So by this stage, I'm using a size 00. Here you can see, so I'm adding some white now as well, so that for the final sort of glare coming from the reflections. Be very careful adding white. If you add too much white, it actually has a negative effect and takes away the shine, because you lose the high contrast. But to go back for adding the paint to the model, don't have the paint too thick. Don't have too much paint on the tip of the brush. Ideally, you will you put the paintbrush into the paint, rub it off on your finger, so that the paintbrush has a sharp tip when you apply it to the model. You don't need a perfectly brand new tip on your brush either for doing this kind of stippling work. If you look on this, so this is a brush that I've been using for a little while. I actually prefer my brushes when they get to this stage because it gives you a slight bit more surface area on the tip of the brush, so it's very easy to do a dot. In fact, I actually find it easier doing sort of highlights on eyes, things like that, you know, where you put the little white dot on there, because you'll get a larger surface area when it touches the model. Sometimes people get really hung up on having the sharpest possible brush, which is great for certain things, but if you want to get a dot, you are either relying on the surface tension of the paint when it hits the model for it to create that round dot, or you can use the shape of the tip of the brush. So if the brush has worn down like a tiny little bit and just leaves like a little rounded tip on there, when you touch the shape to the model, it leaves a very round kind of shape of dot. It makes it way quicker if you've got to do a lot of them, so you can just go like dot 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 dot, and you know, you get a very similar sort of shape over and over. Whereas if you have a very sharp brush, when you do that, you apply a little bit too much pressure, it creates like a triangle effect, because usually on the very sharp brushes there's only like 1 or 2 hairs on the very tip, so a slight amount of pressure will bend over the hair, and that then the paint is like the whole length of that little tip, and it creates like a line or triangle shape with the tip as well. It basically just makes it harder to do lots of little dots. But at the same time, if you need to do really tiny details or very fine dots, then obviously the sharper brush will do. But in this case as well, because this isn't like a Golden Demon piece or anything like that, you don't need to have that finer level of detail. People sometimes get a little bit hung up on because if you're using these paintings as posts for your social media and the model gets zoomed in, obviously, you know, when you take the photo of your model, you put it on social media, it's really heavily zoomed in. You can see all these details that you paint on there, and really fine details are visible. But in reality, you only see those if you've got that model right in front of your face. It's not actually that helpful in terms of, even for display pieces, it's, you know, that fine level of detail is pretty much purely for competition stuff, because you just can't see it. It's more important for this kind of painting to have the high contrast and clarity of painting. So even if you're holding the model like a couple of feet away, or, you know, arm's length, because it's on the game board, the high contrast will stand out. So this you know, high contrast but also weathered bronze effect that I'm painting on there will actually look really nice on the game boards. I know people will be like, oh, but it's non-metallic metal, it doesn't look as good as true metal in real life. But one, no, you're wrong. I don't care what you think. But it's still very high contrast. So although, you know, as you rotate the model, the light won't move around because obviously it's fixed highlights on there, painted on there, it is really high contrast. It's going all the way from black to white on the armor, and, you know, that super high contrast is very, very visible, you know, even from a distance. In fact, it's more visible from a distance, and I think it looks kind of nice. I'm not sure why people get so anti non-metallic metal, but I find it much more fun to paint it anyway. But again, if you don't like it, it's not a problem. You don't have to use it. You know, no one's going to twist your arm and say you've got to paint this as non-metallic metal. In fact, you could do these techniques very similarly with true metals as well. Just there, you saw. So I mentioned before about making a glaze. So I used some Mournfang brown. Took some. Remember, that was the color middle left. Took some from there, put it in the bottom right, added more water to it. So it's around about 4 parts water to 1 part paint there. You know, the exact mix doesn't matter too much. But then I went over the lower panel on the shoulder pad, so just knocked back the highlights on there. Remember, it's not quite as upwards facing as the triangle section at the top here. So there's sort of very obvious distinctions between the different armor panels on the armor, and again, it's pushing the contrast a little bit as well. So it makes this shiny triangle in the, you know, the top part of his armor, makes it look even brighter in comparison. And that's the secret of high contrast, is that you have things will look brighter in a darker environment, and that goes back to what I was talking about. If you use too much white, then it kind of like oversaturates the model. Like, it's the wrong word, because you're not using saturation at all if you're adding white, but it overpowers the model. That's better. It overpowers the white in general, and because the more white that you add, the less high contrast, it actually makes the white less bright. If that makes, hopefully that makes sense. But yeah, so that's the base work for the metals done, and you can spend as long as you want doing that. You can refine that. You can take that up to Golden Demon standard if you wanted. I'm happy at this stage to just leave it like that and then work onto the verdigris effects. Now, if you don't want to add verdigris to it and you just want to keep that that look to it, again, that's perfectly fine. I would be happy to have that as a piece as well. I just thought it'd be fun to have the verdigris effect because it's like old and weathered, and I thought that suited, especially as it's a mummy. It's that sort of old, decayed look to it. I think it would be quite fitting. But if you don't want to do that, again, no one's going to go and tell you, oh, that's wrong. Or they might do, but their opinion doesn't count. So if you don't want to do it, then by all means stop the video now and don't pay any attention to me. The verdigris, as I'm painting it, so I'm using Sybarite green as the first colour. So there's two greens on the bottom right of the wet palette there, and the other one is Gauss plaster green. So these both are watered down around about 3 parts water to 1 part paint. If you notice the paintbrush, I'm using a larger brush again now. So this is a size 2 Artis Opus brush. And what I'm doing is, one, I'm focusing on any recessed areas. So he's got these little spiky, almost teeth bits. You can see I'm just going around the edges there now, hanging off the armour. Anywhere where there's sort of like a recess or a join, that will naturally have more weathering verdigris in it, because on the larger outer flat surfaces, that gets rubbed off on those. Anything where it has like friction contact with another surface, you're basically going to just see more of the metal. Also, when you're applying the verdigris effect, so it's you're not doing the scratchy effect anymore. These are much softer, more open brush marks. Paint them towards the shadows, going from the midtones to the shadows. Do not, under any circumstances, paint the green over the white highlights, because it'll dull them down. You're decreasing the contrast then, and it won't look shiny anymore. Everything will just go green. Now, I say under any circumstances, I'm obviously exaggerating a bit. If you wanted something that was really heavily covered in verdigris, and for something like that, I strongly suggest that you go and get some reference and look at what things look like when they're covered in verdigris, because what they look like is they look green. They just look like someone's got like a chalky green and covered it, and you can't see pretty much anything. You won't get that much of a shine showing through. But if you wanted that effect, now you might not want to spend quite so long on all of the sort of like little shiny reflections and things, all the texture marks, because they'll be more hidden when you apply the verdigris effect on top of them. But it is worth putting some on there, and then you can just add as much verdigris as you want. The reason that I have it so thin, the paint so thin when I'm doing it, so again it's a glaze type effect, is that I have more control. So if I've got the consistency of the paint wrong when I first apply it, that's going to be like a very hard mark on there, and if I decide I don't like it and I've got to go back and knock it all off again, that's a lot of work. Whereas if you have the very thin down paint, you can put it on there, and then if you think, oh, actually I don't like that, it's not quite as much work to fix it. And then obviously, like in the recesses and things, you just go over again with the Gauss Plaster Green, just for the sort of a stronger effect, because as I mentioned, the verdigris will stay more in the recesses because it's less likely to have been rubbed off. And there you go. So obviously I've painted a little bit more here at this stage. I will be on my Patreon carrying on painting this, which will include like the fabric and the little gold skull and all sorts of bits and pieces like that. But anyway, that's the end of this video. Please subscribe. There's obviously going to be plenty more videos coming. I have quite a few things I can't show yet, but it should be interesting anyway. As I said, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.